pressure, depth and volume. In the previous chapter, you learned that an essential feature of the mask is that it incorporates the nose so that it can be pinched closed from the outside. These features of the mask derive from an extremely important phenomenon for us freedivers: the increase in pressure with depth. But what is pressure? In physical terms, pressure is the force acting on a surface. Think, for example, of our planet. Wherever you are, there is air around you. Due to the force of gravity, the air molecules are attracted downwards. That is, they have a weight. This means that every layer of molecules supports the weight of all those above. The weight of the air above bears down evenly and in all directions on the bodies pushing on their surface. This push is called atmospheric pressure. At sea level, the atmospheric pressure is worth 1013 hectopascals. For simplicity, however, we will continue to use the old unit of measurement of 1 atm, atmosphere. If you climb up a mountain to 3,000 meters above sea level, the weight of the overlying molecules of the layer of air where you are is less. At that altitude, the atmospheric pressure is lower than it is at sea level and is about 0.7 atm. In water, changes in pressure happen very quickly and involve quite unusual situations and procedures. Pressure in salt water increases linearly with the depth. It increases by roughly 0.1 atm every meter. To create a pressure of 1 atm, like that originating at sea level from all the Earth's atmosphere, a column of salt water just 10 meters high is sufficient. The pressure generated by the water is called hydrostatic. We divers, on the other hand, are interested in measuring the total pressure at the depth we are at. We will therefore use the absolute pressure, which is the sum of the hydrostatic plus the atmospheric. At 10 meters of depth, you are already at a pressure that is 1 atm higher than that on the surface. That is at an absolute pressure of 2 ATA. While on reaching 20 meters, you will have 2 atm more, meaning an absolute pressure of 3 ATA. Diving under the water, the increase in hydrostatic pressure is immediately perceptible to the tympanic membranes. It is not easy to perceive pressure changes in the rest of the body, as it is made up of solids and liquids that, in practice, reach the new pressure without any variation in volume. The parts of our body that can be affected by the phenomenon of compression are the gaseous cavities. If we took a balloon full of gas under the water, we would immediately see that as it goes down, its volume is reduced. The volume change in the balloon is inversely proportional to the absolute pressure. This means that if the absolute pressure doubles, the volume of the gas halves. If the absolute pressure triples, the volume becomes a third. To understand the effects of pressure on the body, we also need to consider whether a cavity is connected with the outside of the body directly or through a membrane. If you take a bucket under the water, keeping the opening downwards, the increase in pressure causes a reduction in the volume of air, with the water entering the bucket. If instead you descend with the bucket closed with the plastic membrane, the force of the hydrostatic pressure will curve the plastic film towards the inside of the bucket, introflexion, to try to equalize the internal pressure with the external one. As you descend further, the membrane stretches to the maximum, resisting the action of hydrostatic pressure. Inside the cavity, the pressure is lower than that outside. We are therefore in a situation of baric imbalance in compression. Because the pressures are different inside and outside the cavity, and this inequality has occurred during the descent, that is, in compression. The situation can only last until the membrane, now stretched too tightly, breaks due to the still increasing pressure. In order to avoid pressure imbalance, you have to find a way to emit gas into the cavity, equalizing the internal pressure with the external one. This operation is called equalization. Equalization. The parts of our body affected by the compression of the gases during the dive are mainly the internal cavities connected to the respiratory system. These cavities which contain air are affected by this physical phenomenon. While for the lungs, the phenomenon of reduction of the volume of gases during a dive triggers an automatic compensation mechanism called blood shift, which will be dealt with later. As regards the middle ear, it is necessary to act using equalization maneuvers aimed at rebalancing the tympanic membrane, which is pushed by the hydrostatic pressure towards the inside of the ear. The ear is divided into three parts: the outer ear, a simple open cavity that does not require equalization; the middle ear, a gaseous cavity separated from the outside by a membrane called the tympanum; the inner ear, composed of solid and liquid materials and therefore incompressible. The middle ear is the part subject through the eardrum to the phenomenon of the compression of gases. As you dive deeper, the pressure increases, the eardrum introflexes, and if it is stretched too much, gives rise to a fastidious sense of compression, which turns into pain as the descent continues. Continuing the descent even further can cause the tympanum to rupture. Fortunately for us, the middle ear is connected to the mouth through a small duct, the auditory tube, also known as the eustachian tube. With some special maneuvers called equalization, we can emit air into the middle ear from the throat to compensate for the external pressure. The eustachian tube is normally closed to prevent bacteria from entering the middle ear. To open it, it is necessary for most of us to create a slight overpressure in the nose. Generally, this is done by performing the Valsalva maneuver. You pinch your nose with your fingers and gently blow into your nose. However, the Valsalva maneuver, widely used in scuba diving, is not efficient for freediving. For a freediver, it is particularly difficult to use the abdominal muscles to push the air downwards from the lungs to the middle ear, creating the overpressure needed to compensate for the pressure difference. In general, freedivers prefer the Frenzel or Marcante Odalia maneuver. You pinch your nose, close your mouth using your tongue, and lightly press the tongue towards the throat. Your PSS instructor will show you practically the techniques you need to use so as to implement effective equalization. With this action, we equalize the pressure not only in the middle ear, but thanks to internal ducts, also in a series of gaseous cavities of the skull called the paranasal sinuses. We recommend that you do not dive when you have severe sinusitis or a bad cold. In fact, in these conditions, the occlusion of the paranasal sinuses or eustachian tubes can prevent you from performing the equalization maneuver, and not being able to equalize means that making a free dive becomes impossible. If during a descent you feel a sense of painful pressure in your ears, and you can't equalize, you must stop and ascend. You can make other attempts trying during the descent to equalize continuously, but gently. If you do not manage to equalize, it is useless to force it, and for that day you have to abandon the freediving excursion. We also have artificial cavities separated from the outside by a membrane. One of these is precisely the air cushion enclosed in the mask. As the mask skirt is soft, this air cushion reduces in volume under the effect of the increasing pressure. However, when the mask is no longer able to deform, for example, because the rigid frame is pushing on the nose, the pressure inside is lower than the external one. If the difference is great, the ocular capillaries can break, resulting in the leakage of blood, which makes the eye red. Avoiding this effect, called mask squeeze, is in any case very easy. Just blow a little bit of air through the nose into the mask during the descent. Buoyancy. As Archimedes discovered, any object immersed in a liquid receives a thrust upwards equal to the weight of the liquid displaced. This force, called hydrostatic thrust, therefore opposes the weight of the object. Imagine taking a plastic bottle for mineral water with an external volume of 1 litre. When it is completely immersed in water, it displaces 1 litre of water. Since a litre of fresh water weighs 1 kilogram, according to Archimedes' principle, the hydrostatic thrust towards the surface will be exactly 1 kilogram. What happens to the bottle? It depends on what it contains. If you filled it with an element heavier than water, it will weigh more than 1 kilogram. The weight is greater than the hydrostatic thrust, and the bottle will start to sink to the bottom. This condition is defined as negative buoyancy. If you have filled the bottle with water, it will weigh 1 kilogram. So the hydrostatic thrust equals the weight exactly. This condition is called neutral buoyancy. The bottle can stay still at any depth. If instead the bottle is empty, that is full of air, it weighs just a few tens of grams and will therefore return to the surface immediately. This condition is called positive buoyancy. The variation in buoyancy is one of the most important factors which the freediver must learn to live with. Do not believe that it is easy to manage, because it goes from positive to negative during the dive with the increase in depth, and from negative to positive during the ascent. The pressure variation causes an inverse variation in volume, but varying the volume changes the quantity of liquid displaced, and consequently the buoyancy, while the weight stays the same. Ultimately, the condition of buoyancy varies. Let's take a practical example: the neoprene wetsuit. Thousands of gas bubbles are enclosed within the neoprene foam. The bubbles are subject to the pressure increase at depth, and their volume is reduced. A practical consequence of this is that the thickness of the suit is reduced as you go deeper. At 10 meters, the absolute pressure is doubled and the volume of bubbles has been halved. This means that the volume of liquid displaced by the suit is almost halved. Almost, because the neoprene is incompressible. Therefore, the hydrostatic thrust decreases and buoyancy becomes negative. On the other hand, with the neoprene wetsuit, you assume a condition of very positive buoyancy on the surface. To descend without too much effort, you have to wear weights. the weight system. The weight system consists of a set of weights made of lead, which can be easily released and abandoned if it is necessary to assume greater buoyancy. For example, on the surface if you get very tired. The traditional weight system is based on a nylon belt about 5 centimeters high, fitted with a metal or plastic end buckle. The weight belt buckle must be of a quick release type, which can be operated with just one hand. When scuba diving, it is positioned at the level of waist, so that with a reduction in the thickness of the wetsuit at depth, the belt does not slip down onto the hips. When freediving, the abdominal area around the waist must be free in order to allow effective diaphragmatic breathing. So the belt is positioned lower down on the hips. For this reason, freedivers prefer to use an elastic rubber belt. The elasticity of the rubber is able to compensate for the decrease in volume of the suit during the dive, allowing the belt to stay in place during the dive. Lead weights of different shapes and sizes from 0.5 to 2 kilograms each are threaded onto the belt, even if the ideal is to distribute the weight symmetrically using 1 kilogram weights. The belt should not be too long. You will certainly be wondering how many kilograms of weight you will need to use. It is impossible to calculate it first, as there are too many factors that affect the calculation. If you imagine making a free dive, you'll be able to understand how the buoyancy varies during the phases of the dive. On the surface, your buoyancy will be slightly positive, and you will have to overcome this with a pike dive so as to start the descent. During the descent, the pressure increases, compressing the air in the lungs and the gas bubbles in the wetsuit, and the thickness of the suit will decrease. The volume of the chest and the volume of the wetsuit are reduced. Ultimately, you displace less water, and your thrust towards the surface will decrease, with a consequent loss of buoyancy. At a certain depth, depending on the amount of weight used, you will find yourself in a neutral buoyancy zone. This depth is called the depth of neutral buoyancy, and you will neither be pushed upwards towards the surface nor downwards towards the bottom. Typically, you will have to adjust your weights so as to reach the condition of neutral buoyancy at around 10 meters of depth. During the ascent, the volume of air in the lungs and of gaseous bubbles in the wetsuit increases due to the reduction in the pressure, and thus giving you more and more buoyancy. However, your buoyancy will remain negative, and in order to ascend again, you will have to fin until you reach the depth of neutral buoyancy, around 10 meters. Of course, if your dives are limited to just a few meters deep, your depth of neutral buoyancy may vary. Your PSS instructor will explain how to determine the correct amount of weight. The density of the water in which you dive also influences the buoyancy. Salt water is denser, therefore heavier than fresh water. For the same amount of water displaced, in the sea you will receive a greater thrust than in a freshwater lake, so you will have greater buoyancy. To counteract the increased thrust of salt water, you need to add more weights to your weight belt. The difference is about 3% of your total weight, wearing full equipment, including weights. Remember to record the amount of weight you used for each dive excursion in a logbook, so it will be easier in the future to choose the right amount of weight in every situation. In any case, you must check the amount of weight at the beginning of every freediving excursion. Respiration. When we breathe normally, we renew the air in just a small part of the volume of our lungs. The lungs are not in direct contact with the outside. To reach them, the air must first go through a series of cavities, nose and mouth, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, etc., in which gas exchange does not occur and are therefore called dead air spaces. Therefore, with each inhalation, the first air that reaches the lungs is that exhaled in the previous act that has remained in the dead air spaces. This air does not bring an improvement to the oxygen content in the lungs. When breathing through the snorkel, dead air spaces increases, further reducing respiratory efficiency. So when using the snorkel, you need to breathe more deeply. External respiration would be of little use without internal respiration. In order to produce energy, our body needs the oxygen that is present in the air. The molecules of this gas are collected in the lungs and distributed throughout the body via the circulatory system. Blood is pumped from the heart through the arteries to the capillaries where the walls are so thin that the oxygen molecules O2 can pass through them and diffuse into the cells. Vice versa, the carbon dioxide CO2 from the cells enters the capillaries. Oxygen-poor blood is drawn from the heart and pumped to the lungs, where it releases carbon dioxide and replenishes oxygen.